Sometimes, history doesn't whisper from the past, it roars. And that's exactly what happened the day a small, dust-covered leather book appeared at an estate auction in the English countryside. It wasn't bound in gold or marked with a royal seal, but something about it felt magnetic. A hand-stitched diary said to date back to the year 1591, its pages yellowed and fragile, ink faded like it had seen centuries drift by unnoticed. The diary was listed under a vague description, private journal, believed to belong to a noble household, circa late 16th century. No one expected it to cause much excitement. But as soon as a few words from the inside were shared, phrases describing encounters with Elizabethan courtiers, secret voyages, and forbidden experiments, it set the academic world ablaze. Within hours, historians, collectors, and media outlets were scrambling to learn more. Could this really be a first-hand account from the Elizabethan era? Was this the missing puzzle piece historians had been waiting for, something to illuminate what life was truly like under Queen Elizabeth I, outside the polished official records and grand royal portraits? The diary's first page alone was enough to stop even the most skeptical historian in their tracks. Written in elegant yet hurried penmanship, it began. The winds grow foul with rumor and fear, and though the Queen's men smile in daylight, they whisper treason at nightfall. That one line. That tone. It was dramatic, dangerous, and deeply human. It felt alive. And that was enough to draw people in like moths to a flame. Soon after, whispers turned to headlines. Lost 16th century diary found. Possible noblewoman's journal could rewrite Elizabethan history. The diary was said to have surfaced from the collection of an old English family, who claimed it had been tucked away in their attic for generations. No one knew how it got there. No records of its existence. No previous mention in any historical catalogue. Just a sudden appearance, mysterious, untraceable, and too good to be true. And that was exactly what made it irresistible. When experts first got a glimpse, they couldn't help but be enchanted. The language had the flavor of the 1500s, archaic spellings, flowing sentences, and a rhythm that felt authentic. The ink looked aged, the parchment felt old, and even the binding had that centuries-old musk of genuine history. It was as if someone had opened a portal straight into the past. Historians were quick to note small details that gave it credibility. Mentions of real historical figures. Accurate descriptions of Elizabethan attire and customs. Even tiny, seemingly mundane notes about the weather matched recorded conditions from the time. If the diary was real, it wasn't just another historical find, it was a revelation. Think about it, we have official chronicles of the Elizabethan court, yes, but they're often stiff, political, and sanitized. What we rarely see are the raw, emotional accounts from people who lived those moments. The gossip, the fear, the secrets whispered in dark corners. That's what this diary promised, a human side to history. But not everyone was convinced. For every scholar enchanted by the diary's supposed authenticity, another raised an eyebrow. Some pointed out how perfectly it seemed to align with modern storytelling tastes, mystery, power, scandal. Was it really a 16th century mind writing those words, or a clever modern hand trying to imitate one? Yet despite the doubts, the diary's pull was undeniable. Academic institutions began offering to fund its preservation. A prominent museum hinted at a public exhibition. Social media lit up with debates between believers and skeptics. The diary had gone viral before anyone even confirmed what it really was. And maybe that's the strange thing about humanity, we crave authenticity, but we love mystery even more. There was a growing sense that this wasn't just about one old book, it was about what it represented. A bridge between centuries. A whisper from someone who lived, loved, and perhaps suffered in a world long gone. Even the skeptics couldn't fully look away. Because deep down, everyone wanted to believe that something so extraordinary could survive the erosion of time. The supposed author, as later pages revealed, identified herself only by initials EM. She claimed to have lived in service to a noble family connected to the court of Queen Elizabeth. Her words painted vivid scenes of palace intrigue, coded letters, and a forbidden romance with someone above her station. It read like a blend of confession and witness account. And it was hauntingly beautiful. But it also raised an uncomfortable question: why would a servant girl risk everything to write such a diary, knowing discovery could mean death? That paradox only deepened the fascination. If this was genuine, it wasn't just rare, it was miraculous. A first-hand emotional window into a world we thought we knew. And yet, something about it lingered oddly. Too poetic in places. Too cinematic. Like the author was aware her words were being read centuries later. Some historians began to murmur that parts of the diary seemed too aware of its own significance. But for the moment, the allure drowned out the skepticism. Collectors began bidding quietly in the background. The price rose higher than anyone expected. By the time the gavel hit, the diary had sold for nearly $400,000 to an anonymous buyer rumored to be a private museum curator from the United States. And that's when the story truly began to evolve. Because once the diary left British soil and arrived in the hands of American experts, the investigation shifted from excitement to obsession. Teams of historians, linguists, and forensic analysts were called in to verify every inch of the text. Ink samples, fiber analysis, carbon dating, even ultraviolet light scans to detect alterations or hidden writing. Everyone wanted one thing: the truth. Was this really the voice of a forgotten woman from 1591? Or the clever handiwork of a modern forger who knew exactly how to play with our love for history and mystery? At that point, no one could say for sure. But one thing was certain: the world was watching. Because if the diary was real, it would rewrite pieces of Elizabethan history, potentially altering what we know about the politics, social structure, and secret lives of those closest to the throne. But if it was fake, it would become one of the most elaborate and convincing forgeries of the century. The stakes couldn't be higher. That's the irony of the past: it's fragile. One document can breathe new life into history, or distort it beyond recognition. And as the first reports from the U.S. lab began to surface, people were bracing themselves for an answer that could either make or break centuries of scholarship. The world had fallen in love with the diary's mystery, but soon, they'd have to face the truth. When the news of the lost diary of 1591 hit the public, it didn't just spark interest, it exploded into a global fascination. Newspapers called it the Elizabethan Rosetta Stone. Online forums lit up with theories about who the mysterious EM could have been. Some claimed she was a lady-in-waiting to the Queen herself. Others insisted she was the secret daughter of a nobleman, hiding her identity behind initials to avoid scandal. The story had everything: mystery, romance, political intrigue, and a forbidden voice from the shadows of the Tudor court. It was no wonder people couldn't stop talking about it. In the US, late-night hosts joked about it. Historians gave interviews like detectives solving an ancient crime. Museums quietly lobbied for a chance to exhibit it, while social media ran wild with speculation. TikTok creators made short videos decoding its quotes, while Reddit historians debated the authenticity line by line. It wasn't just a diary anymore, it was a cultural event. And yet, under all that noise, attention began to grow. Because as much as the world wanted it to be true, the implications of it being fake were massive. For genuine historians, this wasn't just a juicy story, it was a potential turning point in how we think about the past. If this diary were authentic, it could offer first-hand insight into Elizabethan politics, daily life, and private emotions we've never seen before. For instance, the entries describing whispers of plague and a strange sickness sweeping through London seem to match real outbreaks from the late 1500s. Other passages mention shadowy men of science experimenting with mixtures of mercury and salt, details eerily consistent with early alchemical practices. It felt real. Too real. But that's exactly why the stakes were so high. Because if proven false, it wouldn't just be an embarrassing mistake, it would damage reputations, credibility, and trust in the entire process of historical verification. Imagine if a forgery so sophisticated could fool top historians, institutions, and labs. It would mean our methods of verifying the past, carbon dating, ink analysis, linguistic comparison, could be outsmarted. It would mean anyone, with enough skill and patience, could rewrite history in ink. And that idea terrified people. Still, the hope outweighed the fear, at least at first. The first researchers who saw the diary up close described it as eerily authentic. The ink bled naturally into the fibers, the handwriting had the quirks of a period scribe, and the phrasing felt organically old. In one entry, E.M. described the court gossip surrounding the execution of Mary, Queen of Scots, in a tone that was personal, conflicted, and deeply emotional. "I hear they're mourning for the Scots Queen, yet none dare speak her name without trembling. The air itself feels heavy with guilt." Lines like that struck a chord. This wasn't textbook history, it was human history. It made scholars pause and think, what if this was the voice of someone who actually stood there, watching history unfold from the sidelines? And that's what made the diary so powerful. It wasn't filled with royal decrees or military strategy, it was intimate. Vulnerable. A woman's perspective in an age when women's words rarely survived at all. As weeks passed, debates turned into rivalries. One camp believed the diary was a genuine miracle of preservation. Another saw it as a sophisticated trap. Dr. Charlotte Wilkins, a leading expert in Tudor manuscripts, called it the most important female-authored document since Anne Clifford's diary. But another historian, Dr. James Fenton, dismissed it as too theatrical to be real. He argued that certain turns of phrase, like "the Queen's shadow falls upon every heart," sounded suspiciously modern, more like something a novelist would write than a 16th-century maid. The public didn't care much about the scholarly bickering. For them, it was entertainment wrapped in mystery. Documentaries were announced before any conclusion had even been reached. Book deals were rumored. One streaming service even optioned the rights for a potential drama series based purely on the idea of the diary. The hype machine was unstoppable. But behind closed doors, something else was brewing, a quiet, meticulous investigation. Because for the team of forensic experts and historians now examining the diary in a U.S. laboratory, this wasn't about fame. It was about truth. Meanwhile, the owner who purchased it remained silent. No interviews, no public statements. The diary itself was under tight security, stored in a climate-controlled vault, accessible only to a small group of professionals. But leaks began to surface, small details about the tests being run. Carbon dating of the parchment. Chemical analysis of the ink composition. Spectral imaging to reveal hidden marks or modern touch-ups. Even linguistic pattern testing, software trained on hundreds of Elizabethan-era documents to detect stylistic anomalies. The results weren't released yet, but whispers started making their way through academic circles. Some claimed inconsistencies were already being found. Others said the diary's material seemed too well preserved for something supposedly written over 400 years ago. Still, nothing was confirmed. And in that silence, the fascination only grew. The world had entered a strange emotional tug-of-war. People wanted the diary to be real. They wanted to believe they were witnessing a miracle, a new voice from a forgotten century, a young woman's story finally breaking free from the dust of time. But belief and truth don't always walk hand in hand. As one skeptical historian put it, "The problem with finding what you've always wanted to find is that it's easy to stop asking whether it's real." And that quote seemed to hang over the whole affair like a warning. Because deep down, everyone knew what was coming next. The tests, the analysis, the cold hard data, they would decide the diary's fate. Either it would be crowned one of the greatest historical discoveries of the modern age, or it would go down as one of the most elaborate and devastating hoaxes in academic history. And yet, even as experts prepared to dissect every letter and fiber, the diary continued to enchant the public imagination. Artists recreated its pages online. Readers quoted its passages on social media. Students wrote essays defending its authenticity. Even those who doubted it couldn't help but be drawn in by the emotional pull of its words. Because whether it was real or fake, the diary reminded people of something deeper, the fragile thread that connects us to the people who came before. The need to hear their voices, to know that centuries later, someone still listens. That's what made the stakes so high. If real, this was history reborn. If fake, it was history rewritten. Either way, the truth was coming, and it would change everything. By the time the diary reached the laboratory in Washington, D.C., the excitement had cooled into silence. The kind of silence that comes before a verdict. Every historian, journalist, and skeptic around the world waited for updates. The anonymous buyer had given full permission for the diary to undergo rigorous testing, but insisted on one condition: no public statement until the full results were in. Inside a climate-controlled room, under white fluorescent light, the diary sat open on a glass surface. The pages trembled slightly under the hum of the air filter. Each detail was being studied, every fiber, every ink blot, every faint indentation of pen against parchment. At first glance, it still looked authentic. But science doesn't deal in appearances. The forensic team began with ink analysis. Using advanced spectrometry, they examined the chemical composition of the ink against databases of known historical samples. Genuine 16th century ink, typically iron gall-based, has a specific pattern of oxidation and trace elements like copper and sulfur. At first, the sample matched perfectly, too perfectly. That's when suspicion began to stir. Because in real 16th century ink, the ratios vary wildly from batch to batch. No two mixtures were ever identical. Yet the ink in this diary showed a uniformity across multiple pages, the kind you'd expect from a modern laboratory mix, not from a kitchen-made concoction in 1591. Still, that wasn't enough to declare it fake. For all anyone knew, the diary's author might have had access to consistent materials from a noble household scribe. So the tests continued. Next came paper fiber forensics. Here's where things got even more complicated. The parchment, a fine, treated animal skin, did show age indicators consistent with the 16th century. Collagen degradation, microcracks, and even trace calcium from the liming process were all in line with genuine Elizabethan-era materials. If it was a forgery, whoever created it wasn't just clever, they were a master craftsman. That led to one possibility no one wanted to voice, that the diary could have been written on genuine old parchment, possibly stripped or repurposed from another document. A modern forgery using ancient materials. That idea sent chills through the room. Meanwhile, historians were tackling a different kind of puzzle, fact-checking the accounts inside the diary. They began cross-referencing each event, date, and name mentioned in the text against verified 16th century records. For instance, one entry described a fire breaking out in the northern ward of London during the winter of 1591, and indeed, historical archives confirmed a small fire had been recorded that same season. Another entry mentioned the arrival of a foreign man with curious spectacles that could magnify glass, likely one of the earliest references to lenses used for magnification, which aligned with known experiments happening in Italy around that time. So far, so good. But then came the cracks. A line from the diary read, I saw the Queen's Guards march with their muskets, iron shining in the fog. At first, it sounded poetic. But historians caught a problem. Muskets didn't become standard issue for English royal guards until several decades later. In 1591, they'd have used matchlock arquebus, bulkier, less refined weapons. It was a subtle but glaring anachronism. Then came another red flag. The diary used the term melancholy sickness to describe an illness spreading among villagers. That phrase wasn't recorded in English medical writings until the mid-17th century, decades after the diary's supposed date. Bit by bit, inconsistencies began to pile up. Not enough to call it fake yet, but enough to make scholars uneasy. The linguists got involved next. They ran digital analysis comparing the diary's grammar, word usage, and sentence rhythm with authenticated writings from the late 1500s. What they found was fascinating. The majority of the diary's language matched Elizabethan English almost flawlessly, but scattered throughout were subtle traces of modern syntax. Phrases like "in time to come" and "for all I care" sounded natural today but were virtually absent from documents of the 16th century. It was as if the author occasionally slipped into a more contemporary style, like a modern voice leaking through an old disguise. One linguist described it best. It's like someone spent years learning to speak in another era's voice, but couldn't help letting a little of their own accent show. Then came the ink layering test. Under infrared light, experts noticed faint inconsistencies in ink density. Some words, when examined closely, appeared slightly darker or thicker than others, suggesting they were added at different times. A few letters even overlapped, meaning someone had gone back to touch up the writing long after it first dried. That was the turning point. If the diary had truly been written continuously in 1591, the ink consistency would have been uniform. But these small touch-ups hinted that it might have been carefully constructed, not discovered. Still, the team wasn't ready to call it. Not yet. Because mixed among these red flags were baffling signs of authenticity, references to obscure events that weren't public knowledge until centuries later. Things like minor trade shipments, personal servant names, and obscure court customs, details so specific that even a skilled modern forger would have struggled to invent them. So the debate deepened. Was this a forgery with fragments of truth? Or an authentic document later edited by someone trying to make it more readable for modern eyes? The public, of course, had no idea about these findings yet. But rumors started to trickle out. A journalist from the Times hinted that lab insiders were divided. Online forums exploded with speculation. Some claimed the diary was 100% genuine and that skeptics were trying to suppress a groundbreaking discovery. Others swore it was a scam, a Da Vinci Code for historians. One thing was certain: the deeper experts dug, the more complex the mystery became. Meanwhile, another angle emerged: psychological analysis. If this was a forgery, who created it, and why? The text revealed not just knowledge of Elizabethan life, but a voice filled with longing, melancholy, and intelligence. Whoever wrote it seemed to love that world deeply: the rituals, the court gossip, the superstitions. Some speculated it wasn't about money or fame at all. Maybe the creator was obsessed with the past. Maybe they wanted to be part of it. And that realization changed the tone of the investigation. What if this wasn't a typical forgery, not a con, but a confession of obsession? By the end of the third month of testing, the diary was still holding its secrets close. Every new clue created another contradiction. It had all the science of the past and the fingerprints of the present. The diary of 1591 was becoming less about proving history and more about understanding how deeply people wanted to believe in it. Because whether genuine or not, one thing was clear: the line between history and imagination had never been thinner. And the final tests, the ones no one expected, were about to reveal the truth. The world had been holding its breath for months. Every historian, journalist, and casual history fan wanted the same thing: an answer. Was the diary of 1591 a window into the past, or just a mirror reflecting modern imagination? Then, one rainy afternoon, the statement finally came. The American lab leading the investigation, the Historical Materials Research Institute, released a 40-page report that began with a single, haunting line. The document, known as the Diary of 1591, cannot be verified as authentic to the 16th century. It wasn't the outright fake headline some expected. But it was enough to break the spell. The world paused. Then came the shockwaves. Television anchors scrambled to interpret it, historians raced to explain it, and the public, who had fallen in love with the diary's mystery, didn't know what to believe anymore. So what did the report actually say? The findings were as fascinating as they were devastating. First, the ink. Those near-perfect chemical consistencies weren't a coincidence. Tests confirmed the ink matched a reconstruction formula published in a 1970s restoration guide, something a skilled forger could have easily accessed. The ink was old, but not that old. Next, the parchment. The material was indeed centuries old, but it wasn't blank when the writing was added. Under infrared scanning, experts detected ghostly traces of erased Latin text, fragments of a church ledger likely from the late 1500s. That was the smoking gun. Whoever created the diary had found authentic parchment from the era, maybe salvaged from damaged manuscripts, and written the story of EM on top of it. It was a brilliant move. By using old material, the forger bypassed the most obvious age tests. But the deeper the report went, the clearer the deception became. Linguistic experts confirmed that about 95% of the diary's grammar matched Elizabethan norms, but a small percentage contained clear modern fingerprints, idioms, emotional expressions, even metaphors that simply didn't exist in the 1500s. For example, EM described feeling trapped beneath the weight of time itself. A poetic phrase, yes, but historians traced that kind of self-aware language to Romantic-era writers, not Tudor servants. Then came the handwriting analysis. At first, the script seemed authentic, flowing, slanted, uneven, like someone writing by candlelight. But under magnification, analysts noticed patterns, precise spacing, consistent stroke angles, signs of deliberate imitation rather than natural penmanship. The forger had practiced extensively, copying historical writing samples until they mastered the look, but not the spontaneity. Every test pointed in the same direction: a modern hand, using old materials. And yet, what fascinated experts most wasn't just the forgery, it was the motivation. The report included one unexpected finding. In the back pages of the diary, invisible under normal light, analysts discovered faint pencil markings, numbers, sketches, and initials written in a modern style. One name appeared repeatedly: H. Lorimer. It didn't match any known historical figure from the 1500s. But a quick search revealed that a Henry Lorimer had been a British art restorer active in the 1980s and early 1990s, known for his passion for Elizabethan culture and for experimenting with historical materials. Lorimer had passed away in 1998. Among his possessions, auction records listed miscellaneous old manuscripts and partial parchments. That was the breakthrough. The investigators concluded that Lorimer, or someone working under his guidance, may have created the diary not as a scam for profit, but as a personal artistic project. A love letter to an era he felt spiritually connected to. Over time, after his death, the diary likely changed hands, the original intent forgotten. By the time it resurfaced, it had become something else entirely, a lost treasure waiting to be found. The media, of course, pounced on the drama. Headlines exploded overnight. The Great Elizabethan Hoax. The fake that fooled the world. History's most beautiful lie. The anonymous buyer, who had paid nearly $500,000, issued a brief statement through their lawyer: "We value the diary not for what it isn't, but for what it tried to be. That quote resonated. Because, despite everything, people still couldn't hate it. It wasn't forged to deceive, it was forged to dream. Historians began debating what this revelation meant. Some saw it as a cautionary tale about how easily desire can blur the line between truth and fantasy. Others viewed it as a strange kind of success, proof that even a false story can capture the imagination like real history. But for scholars, there was one uncomfortable question left: how did so many experts, with all their tools and training, come so close to being fooled? The answer wasn't about science. It was about emotion. As one senior historian admitted in a televised interview, "We wanted it to be real so badly, we stopped looking for what didn't fit." That, perhaps, was the most revealing truth of all. In the weeks that followed, universities used the diary as a teaching case. Seminars discussed its forensic details, linguistic clues, and ethical implications. Students examined how confirmation bias, the tendency to believe what we want to believe, could shape even the most objective research. Meanwhile, the diary itself was placed in a museum exhibit under a new title: The Diary That Never Was. Visitors stood in line for hours to see it. Behind the glass case, the delicate parchment still gleamed under soft light. To the untrained eye, it looked no less magical than before. People whispered as they read the first line: "The winds grow foul with rumor and fear." They knew now it wasn't from 1591, but somehow, that didn't matter anymore. Because in a strange way, it still told a truth. Not about Elizabethan England, but about us, about our hunger for stories, for lost voices, for the feeling that the past is still alive and reachable. The verdict was in. The diary was a forgery. But it wasn't evil. It was human. A reminder that history isn't just written in ink and parchment, it's written in longing. And sometimes, the greatest deception isn't in what's created, but in what we choose to believe. As one curator later said at the exhibit's opening, "This diary may not belong to 1591. But it belongs to every generation that ever wished it could speak with the dead." And with that, the room fell silent again. The story had come full circle, from discovery to doubt, from obsession to truth. But the end of the forgery wasn't the end of its lesson. In fact, it was just beginning. When the dust finally settled, and the truth about the so-called lost diary of 1591 came out, the world of history was left with a strange mix of relief, embarrassment, and fascination. Relief, because the mystery was finally solved. Embarrassment, because so many brilliant people had believed in a lie. And fascination, because even in its falseness, the diary had sparked something real, a reminder of why we chase history in the first place. For months, the diary had been treated like a sacred artifact. Now, it sat in a glass case, not as a record of the past, but as evidence of one of the cleverest historical deceptions in modern times. But the story doesn't end there. Because the real question is, what can we learn from all of this? The first lesson is perhaps the most important: the importance of scrutiny. In an age where information is everywhere, it's easy to take things at face value. A photo, a quote, a piece of paper with old handwriting, they all feel convincing if you want to believe. But history has always demanded more. Every document, every artifact, every story needs to be questioned, examined, and cross-checked. The diary reminded us that even experts can be swayed by excitement, and that skepticism is not cynicism, it's a form of respect for the truth. Historians often say, trust, but verify. But this event showed that sometimes, even trust can be a trap. When a discovery feels too perfect, too cinematic, too convenient, it often is. The diary played directly into our collective imagination, a lost voice from the 16th century, rediscovered in pristine condition, filled with poetic reflections on art, love, and politics. It was everything a historian dreams of. And that dream blinded many to the red flags right in front of them. The second lesson is about the value of genuine history. When something like this happens, it reminds us just how fragile authenticity is. Real history isn't shiny or perfect. It's often fragmented, inconsistent, hard to read, and even harder to interpret. Real diaries from the 1500s are messy, written in fading ink, filled with half-thoughts, personal grudges, and trivial details about weather and meals. They're not designed to impress the future. They simply are. That's what makes them powerful. They carry the unfiltered voice of someone who lived, breathed, and experienced the world centuries before us. A forgery, no matter how beautiful, can never replicate that raw humanity. It can mimic the form, but not the soul. The forgery of the 1591 diary, in a strange way, made people fall back in love with real history. Suddenly, museums and universities began revisiting forgotten archives, re-examining authentic writings from the same era. The incident became a wake-up call, a reminder that we don't need perfect stories to be moved by the past. Sometimes, the truth, with all its imperfections, is far more captivating. The third and final lesson is about what we can still learn even from a lie. You might think a forgery has nothing to offer once it's exposed. But that's not entirely true. A fake can tell us a lot about the time it was created in, not the 16th century, but our own. Why did someone in the modern world feel compelled to write in the voice of a long-dead person? What were they trying to say, or prove, or sell? Some speculated that the forger wanted recognition, to create something that would outlive them. Others believed it was a statement against how academic institutions hoard history, keeping it out of reach from everyday people. And then there were those who thought it was a social experiment to test whether the world still cared about the past at all. Whatever the motive, the forgery held up a mirror. It showed that we, as a society, crave connection with history not as a list of dates or names, but as human stories. We want to feel the past, not just study it. That's why the diary captured hearts before it was ever verified. It wasn't about facts, it was about emotion. About the longing to touch something ancient and real. In that sense, the Lost Diary of 1591 succeeded not as a historical document, but as a story that reminded millions of people around the world that history still matters. It made people curious again. It got them reading, debating, imagining. And that's not nothing. But it also set a new standard for historians and researchers. The scandal led to new technologies being developed for document verification, better ways to date paper, analyze ink, and detect anachronistic word patterns. Universities began collaborating with forensic experts and digital historians to create authentication databases. It was as if the field of history had upgraded itself after being fooled. In the end, the diary became both a cautionary tale and a catalyst. A fraud that pushed us toward a deeper appreciation of truth. When we look at it now, preserved behind glass, it doesn't feel like a symbol of shame. It feels like a milestone. A reminder that history is not static. It's alive, and sometimes, even a forgery can make it move forward. Maybe that's the final irony. The diary that never belonged to 1591 ended up changing the way we look at 1591 forever. It forced historians to revisit old sources, double-check old assumptions, and dig deeper into what life in that year truly looked like. In trying to fake history, the forger accidentally revived it. And so, as the years go by, the Lost Diary remains famous not for what it said, but for what it taught. It taught us humility. It taught us patience. And above all, it reminded us that truth, though sometimes hidden, is always worth the search. Because in the end, history doesn't belong to those who forge it. It belongs to those who find it and never stop questioning it.